why am I an atheist? If someone asks me this, I generally reply that I'm an atheist because I have critically evaluated the claims of world religions and found there to be no compelling evidence that any of them are true. That pushes me to the default position of living my life as though there is no such thing as a God. And the problem with this explanation is that it might not actually be quite right. Now, how can I be wrong about my own motivations and lived experiences? Well, it's easy, because the human brain is a fucked up pile of electric meat that simply cannot be trusted. I said that I'm an atheist because of a rational choice, but if you ask me why people are Baptist or Catholic or Muslim or Zoroastrian, I probably would say that they simply inherited that belief from their families and they never questioned it at all. That's the exact type of bullshit that's been shown to happen quite often amongst humans. In many psychological studies, humans tend to say things like, I came to my decision rationally, but my opponent came to the opposite decision emotionally, wrongly. I've heard our consciousness described as a monkey riding on the back of a tiger, thinking, the monkey thinks that he's in control. So when the tiger turns to the east, the monkey makes up a little story about how he really wanted to go east. It's a post hoc explanation that doesn't really have anything to do with the true reality of the situation and why things are happening. The monkey and the tiger metaphor is usually brought up to talk about the illusion of free will, which is something that philosophers are still bickering over and probably will be for quite some time. But we know that this kind of post hoc reasoning happens all the time. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has basically built his entire career on this idea, with perhaps his biggest, most influential paper being The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail, a social intuitionist approach to moral judgment, in which he presents evidence against the idea that moral judgments come about thanks to moral reasoning. He argues that instead of reasoning things out, most people tend to take a gut decision about something and then rationalize it later. This paper is notable for having sentences like, it's just wrong to have sex with a chicken. And if you like that, you're going to love the fact that the paper opens with incestuous erotica. Okay, I'll explain this for those of you who don't feel like clicking through. By the way, I always include a transcript to these videos. It's in the doobly-doo. You can click through to Patreon. It's free. You can read the transcript and it's got all the links to every study I mentioned, including this one. But yeah, if you don't feel like clicking, the study opens with this very entertaining essay. Researchers read subjects a story of a brother and a sister who were adults who went on vacation together. They decided to make the beast with two backs while using two different forms of birth control. They had a good time. They acknowledged that it brought them both closer together, but that they wouldn't really want to do it again. The end. Did they do something wrong? Subjects tended to say, yes, that was absolutely wrong. But when asked why it was wrong, they would say things like, well, incest can result in deformities if the woman gives birth. But these guys used two forms of birth control. She did not get pregnant. Well, incest can really screw up someone's relationship with their sibling or their own mental health. But in the story, it details that the act made both of them happier. Finally, the subjects would just give up and they'd say, I don't know, I just know it's wrong. So yeah, it turns out humans are constantly just doing shit and then making up a reason for it later. I touched on this recently when talking about people rejecting the COVID vaccine. Lots of surveys have been done to figure out why they're rejecting the vaccine so that maybe we can convince them otherwise. But the monkey on the tiger hypothesis suggests that for a lot of people, it doesn't matter why they say they won't get vaccinated because they don't actually have a good reason. It's not that the vaccine wasn't FDA approved because neither is ivermectin for use against this virus. It's not that there's evidence of bad side effects. Study after study shows that the vaccines are ridiculously safe. And it's not that it's new technology because it's not new technology. And also there are vaccines like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that use the same vaccine technology we've used for decades. More likely, it's that these people watched Fox News, read their Facebook feeds, and then made an emotional gut decision. And when asked why they reached that decision, they just try to say whatever comes to mind that they can to explain it. And when you address those explanations, they'll just reach for another explanation. And eventually, you'll get to the point where they say, I don't know, I just don't want to take the vaccine. And there you are. Anyway, let's get back to why I'm an atheist. It's because I'm so extremely rational, right? But a paper published last spring in Social, Psychological, and Personality Science suggests that it might be more likely that I'm an atheist because I didn't see credible displays of faith while growing up. Well, my family and my community were pretty religious when I was a kid, but that is just an anecdote. Let's dig in a little more to see if it's at all relevant. The researchers gathered a nationally representative, in terms of race, sex, income, etc., group of 1,400 Americans. They asked them whether or not they believe in God, and then they also asked them a series of questions to gauge their things like their existential security, so like their faith in government and institutions like healthcare, whether they're an intuitive or an analytical thinker, and their exposure to credible displays of faith as a child. In this case, credible displays of faith refers not just to whether or not your family was religious while you were growing up, but whether or not your family really walked the walk. They went to church every Sunday, but did they put into practice what was being preached? The idea refers back to this 2016 study that offers the following metaphor. If someone says blue mushrooms aren't toxic, that's a verbal expression of faith. If they then eat the blue mushroom, that is a credible display of faith. That study, by the way, also found that exposure to creds, as they call them, predicted religiosity as an adult. For the most recent study, they did find that cred exposure was the biggest factor in predicting whether or not someone believed in God. Being an analytical thinker was a distant second. So there you have it. Atheists aren't more rational than theists. They're just a product of their upbringing like everybody else. Except, maybe not. I will gladly agree that religiosity is socially contagious. There's a reason why we can look at a world map of religion and see distinct separations between the countries. It's not a coincidence that 75% of Indians woke up one day, compared all of the religious options in front of them and said, you know what, it's Hindu for me, while next door, 90% of Bangladeshis opted for Islam. And of course, just as religion passes from parent to child, so too can a lack of religion. However, this study wasn't about atheists being raised by atheists. The idea they're positing is that atheists grew up in homes that may have been religious but were hypocritical or simply lax in their religious practices. A parent who says blue mushrooms are safe but then refuses to eat them for some reason. An aunt who says divorce is a sin but gets an annulment to get out of her own marriage. A grandfather who won't eat pork unless you offer him a hot dog when nobody from church is looking. That kind of thing. And to make it more complicated, this isn't about the reality of that kind of upbringing, but about adults reminiscing about their own childhood. What's the difference? Well, let's use myself as an example. As a kid, I believed my family and my community truly walked the walk. We were Baptists. We believed in charity and kindness and spreading Jesus's teachings and his love. And as far as I was aware, that is what we practiced. Now that I'm an adult, I can look back and see that many people in my community were hypocrites. I know this because today, they are protesting against immigrants coming to the United States, against helping the poor, against sacrificing themselves in some small way, like wearing a mask or getting vaccinated in order to help those who are less fortunate, who are old or immunocompromised. These are all things Jesus was crystal clear on. Like, I read the Bible. He would have been totally in favor of all of those things. So if you ask me now if I grew up in a hypocritical religious community, absolutely yes, I did. But as a child, I did not notice that in the least. I sincerely believed that everyone around me sincerely believed in our religion. With that in mind, I read the list of cred questions to see how I might answer. And here's the questions. Overall, to what extent did your caregivers act as good religious role models? To what extent did your caregivers avoid harming others because their religion taught them so? To what extent did your caregivers act fairly to others because their religion taught them so? To what extent did your caregivers live a religiously pure life? To what extent did your caregivers engage in religious volunteer or charity work? To what extent did your caregivers attend religious services or meetings? Overall, to what extent did your caregivers make personal sacrifices to religion? As a kid, I would have answered a resounding, very high extent to all of those. And I would have answered the same way when I was 17, which is the year that I became an atheist. Looking back now as an atheist adult with a lot more distance and a lot more information, maybe it would be a different answer. And then I think, what if I had never left my hometown for college, which is what I did when I was 17? What if I had never taken that intro to philosophy class freshman year and been allowed to explore all of the questions that I wasn't really allowed to think about as a kid? What if I had never been exposed to people from all walks of life and religions and philosophies? If I were still a Baptist going to church every Sunday, would I notice as an adult how my community or my family's political beliefs and actions don't actually line up with their stated religious beliefs? So how much of this survey is identifying people who really did lack creds as a kid? And how much of it is identifying people who, having decided to leave their religion, can now look back on their childhood with, dare I say, a more rational, or at least a more distanced, less biased viewpoint? I'm not really sure how to separate those ideas without a study in which the researchers speak to all of the families of all of those respondents and delve into their lives to determine how truly committed they are to their faith. Regardless of how much our parents' religiosity affects our own religiosity, it's worth mentioning that in this study, the second most impactful data point was analytical thinking. So, yeah, atheists are likely to have rationally evaluated their belief system. If you watch my videos, you know that I tend to laugh at prominent new atheists who claim to be smarter than everyone else. So even as an atheist myself, I kind of went into this wanting it to be true that atheists tend to be just as illogical as everyone else. The main author of this study told SciPost, a lot of people, atheists in particular, like to talk about how atheism comes from rational, effortful thought. This work joins other recent surveys in finding that this isn't too accurate. But on the contrary, I think this work found that it is accurate. It may be less of a contributor than a person's surrounding culture and upbringing, but of course it's still a contributor, you know? Imagine a fish growing up and looking around and suddenly realizing that there's water everywhere. Culture is overwhelming. Anyone who can step back and look critically at the society in which they were raised is performing an incredible act of rationality, whether or not they end up adopting opposing beliefs to that society and that upbringing. I guess what I'm saying is that it's complicated. You might not know why you believe what you believe, but at least the scientists don't really know either.